Right. Hello, Cormit, to another session of the Online Communist Forum hosted by the CPGB. This week, Yassamine Mather will be speaking about the 100th anniversary of Reza Khan declaring himself King of Persia. What are the implications for today's Islamic Republic, etc.? So,
Thanks, thanks, Beck. Just to add that I'm only giving a short talk, and then after a short discussion, Jack will give the usual online communist forum report. So this is a diversion in some ways. Those of you who attend Palestine demonstrations must have seen that next to the small group of Zionists who counter-demonstrate, there is always Iranians with the picture of Reza Pahlavi, the grandson of Reza Khan that I'm speaking about, and they're quite noisy. In fact, the Iranian royal family has embraced the Zionist cause fully, partly because the enemy of their enemy, the Islamic Republic, must be an ally, but also because Trump has stopped funding for, amongst other things, for all these plethora of democratic human rights, freedom for journalists, freedom for women, organizations in US that were funded by the State Department or by USA. Different organizations supported different things. So in some ways, the Pahlavis are now left with one major funder, the Israeli Zionist state. So it's no surprise that there's a picture, for example, of ex-Empress Farah Diba standing next to an Israeli minister proudly carrying the Zionist flag. Why should we pay any attention? Well, in some ways, it's very difficult to know if they are gaining popularity. If that is the case, my own argument would be that we should blame, on the one hand, of course, the funding by Zionists, but also the Islamic Republic, because I know revolutions don't die off and become terrible unless the classes, the working class has done that revolution. But this one is really in a disastrous state. There is a lot of opposition to the religious state. The economy is in almost daily downfall, and the pressures by the US in terms of sanctions and so on don't help. However, it is surprising, this revival, at least amongst exile. It's very difficult to judge what is going on inside Iran. So I'm just talking about exiles and the stupid scenes many of us have to encounter when we are on the Palestine demonstrations to see fellow countrymen, Iranians, carrying the Zionist flag. But I think one aspect of this is the financial support they get. So how did we get here? There has been, in addition to the organizations I mentioned, funded by the Republican Party, by the National Endowment for Democracy, by various right-wing organizations in US, one of the sources of publicity for the ex-royal family has been the TV stations paid by Israel too, notably. And the way they operate is not, at least one of them until its demise last year, but they're not overtly political. They show music from the Shah's era, quite bad music, actually. But they built this nostalgia about how great things were under the Pahlavis. Amongst these, it's very difficult to build, if you like, a great picture of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah, the ones that the revolution of 1979 overthrew. Why? Because there's so many memoirs in Farsi about people around him who have written after his death and at times after their own death, published diaries that shows that he was a megalomaniac, a misogynist, someone who had no respect for his own close relatives, for his close family, but also was a tyrant. However, this is different when it comes to building, if you like, a myth around the Shah's father. And what is rarely known is that, in fact, Reza Khan, or who later became Reza Shah, so the coup d'etat he organized was in 1929. The coup d'etat the British organized for him was 1921. And then in 1925, he declared himself to be Shah, king. He's portrayed as the savior of Iran. And the one who is the father of modernizing Iran and so on. There are many contradictory stories about this, but we should start maybe with the fall of the Qajar dynasty. They were in power between 1789 and 1925. However, the last years, I would say from 1905, the constitutional revolution, there was a lot of political instability. Foreign interference was obvious to everyone. There was total corruption. The court and its surroundings were basically falling apart. Iran was in economic decline. Russia and Britain had divided Iran unceremoniously. And the coup itself was not so much aimed at the Qajar monarchy because they were on the sidelines. They were living their lives in palaces and weren't directly involved by that stage in political events. But it was directed against the cabinet of a military man, Sepahbod Fathollah Akbar, and the oligarchy of landowners, bureaucratic officials who dominated the regime at that time. Many would argue that it was actually the man who was in charge was not Reza Khan, but Ziauddin Tabai, a kind of he started as a reformist journalist. Apparently, he quite liked Kerensky. But most importantly, he had the trust of the British military and the diplomatic personnel in Tehran who had ties with him. But he didn't have enough in terms of military army power, military organization, and so on. Reza Khan, who was a Cossack officer of very modest origin from the north of Iran, had risen because of his military background and I think the British at that time thought maybe Ziauddin was too much of a danger. They wanted their own, if you like, most obedient person. So Major General Edmund Ironside, who was in charge of something I had not heard until I did some work on Reza Shah, called the North Persia Force. He was in charge of that, and he organized Reza Khan. He was in touch with Reza Khan, and he managed to basically, it was through his tutelage that Reza Khan got involved. The Cossack unit near Qazvin was under a British guy, Henry Smythe, I think Smith or Smythe, I think he's called. And Ironside and Smith recognized Reza Khan as someone who could be trusted. In 1919, i.e., 2 years before the coup, the Anglo-Persian agreement had been signed, a new version of it, and it was to strengthen the central government, basically under British tutelage. However, there was quite strong opposition by nationalists, by Iranians who opposed it, and Russia's interventions in the north of the country made the situation worse. Remember, this is 2 years after the Russian Revolution. So for Britain, one of the main concerns, one of the worries was that there might be a Bolshevik-backed movement against Tehran. And that's why they decided that the Soviets had moved out of the Persia, the British Russian Tsarist Russian agreement. So on the 18th of February 1921, a very small number, 2,200 Cossacks and 100 gendarmes, led by Reza Khan, marched from Ghazvin to Tehran. The royal court, the Qajar dynasty, told them to return. They ignored that. They knew they had the backing of more important powers, the British. And basically, Reza Khan came to power. He pledged allegiance to the Shah, but he said he will, if you like, deal with the oligarch, deal with the landowners, major landowners who were problematic for most of the country, not just him. Immediately after the coup, many political activists who were not part of the coup, who were nationalists, liberals, leftists, were arrested. But some major landowners were also arrested. Martial law was imposed. The gatherings of political gatherings were banned. The press was stopped. Government departments were completely reorganized. And basically, the British told the king, Fath Ali Shah, to name Ziauddin as prime minister with full powers and to confirm Reza Khan as Sardar Sepah, which means the commander of the military forces, chief military person. And between the two of them, this was typical of coups. I mean, those who remember in Iran 1953 coups, they know that immediately afterwards there's a furor of political activities, military buildups, and so on. But at the same time, the coup with British finance and support, financial support, was trying to, if you like, reduce the economic decline of the latter years of the Qajar dynasty. And there are very contradictory reports about who was the most important person in the coup itself. My guess is that Ziauddin was if you like, the more intellectual, the brains behind some of the activities, but Reza Khan was the muscle. However, they both claimed that they were the main person, and it was agreed that this division of power reflected what was going on within the Iranian government. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid saying too much, to take too much time. By July of 1921, some Cossacks who had remained, who had then become Red Army soldiers, but they were not accepted by the Soviet Union because these Cossacks were Russian troops who became part of the Red Army, but they were dissociated from the Soviet Union. They left the northern parts of Iran and returned to Soviet territory. And this was, if you like, the period marked as the end of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Iran, SSRI it's called. It was a revolutionary enclave that tried to unite the more radical Bolshevik Iranians, if you like, and social democratic factions, and they set up this republic. There is a complicated story about why the Soviet Union decided not to support this. There are people who argue that it was, if you like, a betrayal of Iranian communists. On the other hand, you can understand that the first socialist republic had enough problems without trying to deal with problems in the southern border at a time when they didn't trust the possibilities that the small enclave of Iranian, northern Iranian, mainly communists, will be able to achieve much. So although there are Iranian communists who have written a lot against the Soviet decision to, if you like, abandon the Gilan republics, there are good reasons to believe that it made sense, I would imagine, at the time. Reza Khan remained in this position of army leader until he gradually removed the Ziyadin from power. He became more and more authoritarian. And in 1925, he declared himself Shah. And that is officially recognized as the end of the Qajar dynasty. So we mark that as the end. He did quite a lot of, if you like, construction in Iran, but quite a lot of it, and this is explained by historians who've looked at these events. For example, his modernization initiatives, both in terms of the legal and economic reform, were very often as a response to pressures of opposition in the country. On the legal issue, he's credited with ending capitulation. Capitulation meant that if you're a British citizen and you committed a crime in Iran, you couldn't face trial. As a result of capitulation, Iran had to build lots of prisons. So it was inevitable that they couldn't put foreign prisoners into the kind of dungeons Iran had. So in a way, the legal reforms went hand in hand with that. There were educational reforms. The infrastructure was changed, but the changes in infrastructure, if you like, the growth of capitalism and industry was partly also to do with the British individuals. Agricultural reforms were also on the card, and although some of the larger landlords lost some property because of nationalization of some land, much of this land was distributed to Reza Khan's own political and military allies. The peasants it was, if you like, a precursor to what happened later under Mohammad Reza. They were landless, they became cheap factory labor, or if they couldn't do that, urban shanty town dwellers. There was a lot of industrialization, but again, no protection for the workers. In terms of oil resources, he completely gave in to whatever the Anglo-Persian Oil Company demanded. This later became British Petroleum. In Iran, in southern Iran, people were told BP stands for Benzine Pars, which was obviously a lie. They retained control over Iran's oil field. revenues disproportionately benefiting the British government. And there was complete lack of economic dependence. He entirely relied on foreign capital and resource extractions. Two other events, sorry, I'm speaking longer than I wanted to, but two other events should be mentioned. One is his attempt at kashf hijab, mandatory unveiling of women. He had previously asked men to remove their hats, the old Iranian Turkish-looking hats that men had to be removed. But this mandatory unveiling, hailed now by the royalists and by quite a lot of liberal Iranians as a great gesture, was actually a precursor for the kind of repression women faced after the Islamic Republic, where hijab veiling became mandatory. So the unveiling was done in a very crude manner. It was very much a class issue, because the upper classes and the middle classes in urban areas were happy with this, while the urban poor, the countryside, were not happy with this. So it became a situation where the term chadori, which means a woman who wears the long Iranian hijab, became a class insult. So people would use it as an insult. The second issue I need to talk about very briefly again is his relationship with Germany. I had in the past said that he had Nazi sympathies. Having asked a lot of questions from people who worked on this and read some of the works that people have written on this, I think he had become wary of the British ruling everything he did, and he saw German, if you like, Germany involvement with Germany in terms of industrialization, the building of railway, and so on, as an attempt to show a bit more independence. And of course, the Germans liked him because he was authoritarian. The Nazis liked him, and he was a militarist man, and so on. And he was also cracking down on socialist, communists, and so on. I think it is true to say that if you like, anti-Semitism is something that was brought to the Middle East by Europeans. It didn't exist. And therefore, we can't say he had Nazi sympathies, but he definitely was very close to the Germans by 1941. And this is the year where the Allies decided, we brought him to power with a coup, we just get rid of him. He was unceremoniously put on a ship destined for South Africa. He thought he was going to India for a short for a short exile and maybe allowed to come back, but he was actually sent to South Africa, and as a compensation, his son was declared Shah, and he was happy because at least the dynasty, this bizarre dynasties that started with a coup against another dynasty would continue. But of course, as you know, the son's rule had its own problems. I'll finish here and let comrades speak.